Hello there. To celebrate the publication of the first audiobook in the series Guidance for Life on Earth, Teachings and Practices from Inner Guides, you're welcome to this conversation between me, Stephen Busby, and Dave Schoof. We discuss how these materials came about in my life and my experience of writing and working with the books, and of audio recording Book 1. You'll find more information on all these materials at guidanceforlife.info. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So, Stephen, you've written 4 books and you're in the process of completing the recording of the audio for the first. And I noticed you refer to this as the material. What is the material? What's that about?
Yeah, what is the material? The materials come to be something that I experience as an inner process that I'm able to put into some kind of form, a form of words. And the simplest way to express it is when it's happening, then there's a very clear sense of a certain voice or voices inside that want to express something, an idea or a concept in a certain way or with a certain energy. And when I say voices, I don't mean that there's something that I hear in the usual way of that. There is no sound as I might usually experience that, but there is a very compelling sense, or inner sense, of something wanting to be expressed, often in a very specific way. And that if I allow myself to be in a space where I can listen more intently and internally to that, then that becomes very clear. I would say that it's not in any way any kind of dictation or anything like that. There's more an inner flow of I guess you could call them impulses, where the intention behind the expression seems to me very clear. And that's then what comes to me very clearly. And it's very obvious to me when certain words want to be used, or a certain way of expressing something feels right to me internally, as opposed to others which I might try out, which feel less right. That's my experience of the flow and the way this material comes through me. And then how that material takes written form is often more of how I know how to write, putting a certain form upon this inner flow. Although again, that feels to me like a highly kind of cooperative experience, really. There's an immediate knowing of how to express and form ideas and concepts, and very often the words are simply clear.
Yeah, I'm struck by how it comes through. And you said you pause and you'll test some things, it sounds like. How do you know it's this guidance, this voice, as opposed to your own internal decision making or judging?
Yeah, a great question, and it's a common question, isn't it, in these kinds of fields of study or research. And the best way I can answer that is that at the level at which this comes in, or at which I'm experiencing it, that question somehow becomes less relevant. I'm not sure there is such a hard and fast distinction between what is me, or which parts are me or mine, and which parts aren't, strictly speaking. The whole experience feels to me so woven as as um, as a tapestry of what comes from me, or my larger or deeper sense of self, as I've learned to experience that in this material, and a very tangible sense of other presences who are working with me and who bring a certain energy or intention to this cooperative work. And so since the first experiences, I've become a lot less concerned with those distinctions. And what I've been learning is that that's actually a part of the work. Is that as we learn to to trust ourselves in who and how we are, inside ourselves or as part of our greater selfhood, then those distinctions and boundaries um, need mean less to us.
Yeah, they almost sound like there's less of a blockage if you're trying to worry about that and figure that out. I'm curious where you've referred to them as guides. How did they come into your life?
Yeah. They, so what I'm referring to here as they, I experience as a collective, and they burst into my life in a certain way, which I'll try and describe. But I would like to say before that that at the time they burst into my life, there had been many years before that of feeling shaped, guided from the inside in what I was doing, particularly in the area of my work. And that, that went back many years, right back to earlier in life, when, following a health crisis, I felt guided to dive into what's known as family and sometimes as systemic constellation work. And my sense of being guided from the inner in that field of work, as I learned it, became very strong. And that evolved into other kinds of work, which followed on, called, for example, deep systems healing, for some years, and then followed by embodying higher consciousness. Throughout all those years, there was a clear sense of that whenever I found myself in any kind of working environment, or any place where there was any kind of professional relationship being engaged, then there was a very strong inner sense of almost always knowing what to do, or say, or how to be, and often what not to say or how to be. So those were the kinds of fields of work that I developed and was thriving in when, during a plant medicine ceremony with some friends, one of the first that I experienced, something shifted inside, kind of clicked or dropped down, and my whole body became completely immobile. It was as if, in a sense, I'd left the body, or that I was no longer able to move myself very easily, or be in the body in any way that I recognized. And this quite kind of disembodied voice started speaking through me. And I noticed from the very first moment of that I was quite happy kind of stepping aside, inside myself, as it were, and bearing witness to this while it came through. And this voice spoke I believe it spoke for hours as I simply lay there. I don't have a full recollection from that first time of what exactly was said, but very similar to what you can find in the books today. There was a stream of um, and I think the best word to describe this is some form of guidance, higher guidance intended for us as humans in the world in which we live, at the level of which we live, seeming to come from a presence, an identity of some kind, which, at least in my experience, clearly was not and is not in the world in which we live, and is not operating at that human level. And that was the first experience of the stream, and following that, um, or at least I could say part of that experience, because I think this is interesting for the kind of work we're involved in here. When I say that the body senses were disengaged or dampened down, the perceptual senses were heightened. So I noticed that I could hear, for example, the slightest sounds going on within that room and outside that room, as if they were vastly amplified to me. And that continued for a long time afterwards, as did a heightened visual sense and a sense of being able to perceive light around objects and other phenomena, for example, which can sometimes come in. And that seemed to have been activated during that experience. And then after that, there was no need for that kind of setting anymore. I found that I could intentionally invoke that inner experience, and the stream would simply come in. And very soon after that, I didn't need so much anymore, or at least so dramatically, to leave the body in the same way. I could be here in some settled movement, for example, though not so much, and be completely aware of what's happening around me. Although in those early years, it certainly helped to keep my eyes closed. Doesn't seem to be so necessary anymore. And that's how the experience evolved, really. Part of those early experiences were so as if a part of me needed to get so much out of the way, so as to make space for what I believe is a cooperation or a partnership with these other presences. In those early experiences, that the kind of the posture or the form of my jaw, for example, would alter slightly, so that coming out of those early experiences, I had to find my own sense of how my mouth would move easily again. There was that much of a distinction between the inner guidedness and the person I recognize more as me, and that diminished over time, so that there isn't that kind of sharp or jarring transition anymore in my experience.
Extraordinary. I mean, it's fascinating. And before the plant medicine experience that then became more of a stream, the early days, was that the same kind of guidance that evidently you were trusting right from the spot? Or when you started getting more of this stream experience, was that a different form?
Yeah, it's not the same form, or it's never been the same form, in the sense that there isn't one kind or quality of presence, and it's certainly not singular. I would say in any way. Right from the start, there was a sense of being accompanied by many or multiples, if you like, and that's continued. And what has become obvious, especially in the books, and I think this is stated at one point in book one, is that different voices or qualities or areas of intelligence are called in through the guidance relative to the theme that I want to explore, or relative to the questions that other people bring. That there's a sense of, if you like, a kind of a community available, as it were, uh, within the inner realms that can draw upon many different kinds of sources of wisdom and intelligence that seem to me inexhaustible.
You say something that catches my ear, and that is a conversation may be happening, and then that will help catalyze something. So it sounds like being in relationship with others, being in contact with others, somehow seems to create more of a fluid environment.
I mean, there's nothing as helpful or compelling for this as some kind of question being asked, whether that's something that I'm wondering about, or I'm feeling very concerned about in the moment or in my life generally, or whether it's something that somebody else or some other people around me in a group that we're working in, for example, is asking, then that's that's very activating of the inner stream. And my sense of the stream, or what I'm calling the stream here, is that even though I may not be aware of this, that there is a constant presence available. And as I've deepened into exploring this, and my experience of working with other people like yourself and many others, is that this presence is available to all of us, all of the time, in any circumstances, should we wish it. It may not be experienced in the same way at all by different people, and, for example, not necessarily as a stream in the way that I experience it. But what I've understood so far is that there is a constancy of presence of some kind available to us on the inner, and that can take many, many different forms as we, express interest or agree to explore there further.
Are you ever surprised at what comes through?
Yes, I would say mostly. I mean, when I, for example, I'm wondering something, or I'm hearing a question or something being wondered by somebody else, then I don't know if you have this experience. There's often a sense that actually some kind of answer or response is even known or knowable sometimes before a question begins
Mm,
to be asked. And
mm,
I've learned that that is part of this inner experience of being accompanied, although sometimes that seems to come very much from within ourselves. Uh, However, often in my experience, in when I'm working, then the stream comes in at a very early point in those inquiries. And as I think is described in book one, or perhaps book two, what at a human level we experience as knowing, as being able to know something, um, within a much vaster sense or scale, and in deeper inner terms, often what is known completely as a whole, already fully formed. And when I work like this from the inner, there's a sense of, let's say, when you're asking me a question, whatever my own personal answer might be, spread out in time, as it were, um, there's a version of that answer, or of that knowing, of that intelligence, already completely fully formed,
mm.
but not in any way we ordinarily, recognize in human terms.
That's quite a big piece. I'm noticing, even you've said it before, I've read it, and still each time there's a surprise that I feel in me about that. Is there, is it that this already known and completeness, as we evolve and do this work more, does that already known and completeness become more evident?
Yes, I think we become more able to detect and discern
Mm,
that, and
mm,
to tap into that, and to use a word that's significant in the material, to embody that knowing, so that it's less in a familiar human way. It's less a question of me or you wanting or needing to know something, and rather of me or you realizing, on the one hand, that we can become knowers, or we can become that knowing,
yes.
and secondly, on the other hand, that we already are that knowing, and that what we're learning to tap into is a sense of experiencing ourselves as sources or expressions of knowing whenever we wish. And obviously, that's a practice. I should say that practice is another term that's crucial to the body of this material. You know, the material is partly consists of a series of practices, kinds of exercises, if you like. Often they involve some form of guided inner meditation or sequence of steps, which it's pointed out in the material we don't necessarily need even to believe in a sense, or to
Mm,
approve of. But if we
mm,
do want to have a go and follow those steps and check out these practices, then something comes in, a level of knowing in us seems to be engaged, and then to become more available and more embodied in us as we do that. And that's my sense of what's meant by the practices in the material.
mm. Yes.
In other words, maybe to add the obvious, as some readers have done, I've noticed that these aren't books to be read in the ordinary sense that I might pick up a book and wish to understand something or be entertained in a certain way. Whether or not I follow the practices, and some I might want to, and others I might feel less drawn to, there's something being worked through us as readers as we go through this material, so that
Mm,
the books become, um, even in what might appear to be a simple reading experience, uh, highly experiential, in the way that this inner or higher knowing or higher intelligence is introduced into the human experience. And that's an essential aspect of the materials.
yes. And that highly experiential, I certainly have experienced that. And what I keep noticing over and over again is how the books land with me differently each time I go back in. It's almost like another layer, or after some practices going in, something new is emergent that I didn't quite pick up before. And all of a sudden, there's this expansion of understanding. Can I ask you a question about more of the arc of your experience with receiving guidance? It sounds like from the very beginning, you had a high level of trust. And I'm curious about that because I notice in the early parts of this work, I didn't. I would often doubt myself and wonder if that was just my, like, how is this different than intuition? Um, what do you think?
When you say trust, do you mean trust in what?
Trust in what I'm receiving and trust that it's guidance as opposed to my personality needs that somehow confirming something that I want to have happen.
Yeah, I would say with practice and certainly with life experience, I've learned to trust that I know the difference between what you've just described. However, that distinction, as I said earlier, has become less important in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think you're putting your finger on a really fundamental aspect of the work or the practices here, which is not so much that we're being invited to learn to trust ourselves more, but more being guided towards a realization that we are actually, in a way that's not easy to understand, that we are already trust embodied. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't be getting through our days at all. There's a level of trust um, into which we come as human form from birth that is absolute and is known, way beyond or beneath what's called in the material ordinary mind as we experience it. And that's a level of fundamental knowing in life or fundamental trust in life, which we're learning to draw upon here. I would say more intimately, ever more intimately as we go on.
So you were talking about how we don't read these books in a traditional way, and the information that comes through them is not traditional. I'm curious. You just finished the recording of the first book, so now this is bringing voice to the material. What's that been like for you?
Yeah. First of all, when I was writing the books, and the sentences and paragraphs were forming, then there was a sense of in writing or in typing, of the words and sentences being heard or recited through me. And a sentence, I noticed I didn't want to accept a sentence or a way of expressing an idea
Mm-hmm.
unless it had a certain rhythmic quality to it, a certain tonality, if you like, and I would either speak aloud or recite those sentences as I was writing to myself. So there was from the beginning that impression of being with or in sound very much. And I've heard from some readers since who do find that the material works, if you like, in some way, if they either silently read, but in a kind of a way that's conscious of the sound that's being made as they
Mm-hmm.
read, or
Mm-hmm.
that they read aloud to themselves, or sometimes even read aloud to each other, which is suggested in the books actually. So that's also been there. And then when I started to record the audiobook for book one, I was astonished that although this was material that I'd written, I think almost 3 years earlier, it sounded distinct and even new to me when I
Mm-hmm.
began to read it aloud in front of a microphone. And as I allowed myself to read slowly enough, to read at a pace which seemed to be right for a public recording, then my experience of the sounds which were being made actually took me back even deeper into the
Mm-hmm.
original material.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading, I found insights or ideas or connections being made or possible through the material. live in real time, if you like, in the recording, that were new to me, that it seemed to me that I hadn't realized before. And I had this distinct impression again, which I think is quite common for many people in this material, that there are many layers actually laid one on top of the other, if you like, within this
Mm-hmm.
material. There's a surface layer which is very much about how something is being expressed in language as we know it, which we use through our experience to gain a certain understanding of something. And then beneath that layer of language, there are other layers or levels embedded within that that take us deeper down or deeper inside to the places where those ideas or concepts come from,
Mm.
kind of simultaneously. So again, I gather this is a question of practice. There's an inner sense, one of many, that we can cultivate through the field of this material, whereby you can become much more aware simultaneously of many things or many layers or many aspects being sensed, felt, or understood at the same time. In a way that is not at all problematic or even stretching for us as we agree to practice in this way. And I think that is a way in which this material is intended to be, so something to be experienced. It's experientially formed in that way, so that one becomes more multi-leveled, as you like, in terms of sensory awareness while you work with the material.
If someone is new to this, does this take years and years to build that kind of capacity?
Not at all. I mean, if
Mm.
if if somebody feels tempted or drawn, instinctively or in whatever way towards this material to check it out, then I would say in the case of the audiobook, just allow yourself to listen um, at the beginning or even randomly somewhere within the material in a very easy, relaxed, even background way, so as to notice if there's something kind of opens or becomes alert or interested in you that wants to go further, but without making of that any kind of task or thing that you have to
Mm.
do or thing that you have to understand in any way. And the same with the books, and I've heard this from readers already through the four books so far, that some people gain most by having a book accompany them regularly in their life, which they pick
Mm.
up at moments or in phases of their life where they feel they need some kind of inner support. And very often, then, for example, opening the book intuitively at a certain place may lead them to an offering that is useful or highly relevant for what they're going through in their life, or they found themselves drawn back to reading from the beginning, even repeatedly sometimes, as I
Mm-hmm.
found through the recording work. There's a freshness that is available here because of its layeredness, which seems to always be there.
Mm. Yes. Stephen, what's your sense of why you're bringing this to the world and why now?
Well, I'm doing this. I'm engaged in this kind of work because I feel, or I felt increasingly, that I couldn't do anything else. That I couldn't, or I simply wasn't here to do or pursue anything else in my life. That became compelling, not in a way that seemed to leave me no choice in a hard way, but just as something which became the absolute primary fundamental driving impulse or energy in my life. And it has been and continues to be so enriching and surprising and fulfilling for me, um, in both in ways in which to myself, as I'm by myself with or in the material, and especially when with working or exploring with other people in the material too, incredibly enriching. So that's just at my own level, and my sense of, certainly from the content of the material, what I understand from the inner stream of guidance is that, on the one hand, this is timely material, timely uh, wisdom or intelligence, that needs to be brought in to the human realm at this time. That there are things here for those who wish, and not to be imposed upon anybody in any way, but simply for those who feel drawn to this material and for those who wish, there are important things here to be understood and explored for those individuals, as far as I understand it, as representative of a much wider or even the whole human collective. Um, that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a reminder. I believe it's in book one, that actually these kinds of streams of wisdom have always been available to
Mm,
humankind
mm,
throughout recorded human history, certainly, and beyond or before, and have always played a very important part in the way that humanity, as we understand humanity, appears to have evolved. And that this, in that sense, then, that this is nothing new, and that even within our era, our historical timeline, there are many, many published sources of these kinds of guidance available to us, or available to those who wish to look for them and search them out. And in that sense, when you do that and dive into several different kinds or versions, you notice a communality, that there's something here coming from a place or a level of intelligence, of very benevolent intent, that is here for humanity, intended to accompany us in our unfolding development.
yeah. And what occurs to me in that last piece that you said, it doesn't, because it's already here, already available in many different forms, there isn't a compatibility issue with my belief system or a particular philosophical or spiritual path I may be following.
Yeah, and of course the material, this particular material, and probably like all such
Mm,
material, which seems to come from an inner place, is very much shaped and formed, or maybe deformed, through my
mm,
own filters and biases
yes,
and
yes.
prejudices and belief systems. I'm I was acutely aware of that in the early stages, even embarrassingly so, and then was shown through, I think, chapter two in book one, that this need not be framed as problematic in any way, but is a necessary shaping and forming through a particular human container, so that it's the way it is shaped and formed becomes comprehensible to other people in a way that they too can relate to through their filtering,
Ah,
if you
yes,
like.
yes. Hmm. Stephen, a question I've got is, in working with the material, I'm very keen on bringing this into my life more. I see great benefit, already have. Um, Can you say more about what does it mean to integrate and maybe what it's like in for you in your personal life?
Well, first, an ever ongoing process, sometimes a lovely, graceful, pleasing one, and other times a much bumpier ride.
Hmm.
What I've understood, from my own learning with teachers earlier in my life and through these materials is that actually what gets touched and worked on or awakened in us is far below or beyond, what we experience as the psychological level or sometimes the emotional level. That what the material calls inner structures or deep inner energetic structuring in us, partly our own, partly derived from the way we've been conditioned through our cultural or family or educational upbringing and so on. It is these deeper energetic structures that are affected by engaging with material like this, far below whatever we might be aware of or believe that we're working on. And that feels necessary to or helpful for me to remember, because it seems to be a feature of working with this material for me, and I gather for other people, at least certainly in the groups that many of us have worked in together, that surprising features of our lives can suddenly become more like directly perceptible or even more directly experienced to us, ways
Hmm.
in which typically, we've held ourselves back from a fullness of involvement or engagement with life in
Hmm.
ways that we now begin to realize we could be engaging or involving ourselves in life. Ways or aspects of how we experience ourselves as a personality that suddenly become more tangible or more raw in how they have always expressed themselves and now become more nakedly so, if you like. So as these kinds of parts of ourselves seem to become sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly more obvious. And to put it simply, the way the material frames this is that these are kind of surface symptoms, or sometimes surface shifts, or even little eruptions sometimes of much deeper inner movements that are ongoing all the time, if you like, at a more tectonic level, as these inner energetic structures are more constantly allowed to shift and move and evolve within us. So the guidance is not to become too um, concerned or fixated on what seems to be happening on the surface of our lives, and I've been learning to do that, though not to use that invitation as an avoidance of what's happening on the
Hmm.
surface of our lives either. To become more kindly and compassionately interested in the parts of ourselves that might seem to be coming up from the underground, that I might not be very proud of, and often aspects or structures which seem to be touched or covered in some shame. For example, in my
Hmm.
case, I think for many other people too, for example. but simply to learn to create a space, if possible, a space alongside other people who are similarly engaged in working this way, so that these mini or major realizations or revelations can be gently received and borne witness to by ourselves and if possible, by each other, between us. And it's in this way, kind of, if you like, a bit surreptitiously or not in obvious ways, that we find ourselves often, with hindsight, having evolved quite a long way from the person whom we may have experienced ourselves or believed ourselves to have been previously. Finding to our surprise that there are aspects of ourselves at the level of the personality, for example, which have become more fluid or more healthily expressed in ways that we might always have wanted to or longed for before, but now seem to have become more available to us and available to a more fully lived life, almost as a side effect of engaging in these kinds of
Mm.
fields of work.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way I would express integration.
Mm. So much of my own personal development time has been very individual, very self-focused. You've mentioned several times the doing this work alongside others. That sounds like a very important piece to this. Can you say more about coming into spaces where you're working with other people or sharing this?
Yeah, I think there's a very primary and, if the material suits you, a very engrossing and beautiful way that you can engage alone with this material, as a reader or as a practitioner by yourself with the practices in the books, um, and that's fantastic. There is there is an invitation in the material which becomes quite persistent, that for those of us who feel the slightest impulse, the deeper opportunity here is to engage with other people, either whom we know already or whom we don't know already, but people who, through meeting in fields of inquiry or study like this, can, of course, form spaces or relationships of inquiry and practice together. But actually, beyond that, that the main thrust of the material is what's called in the material a collective thrust. That there's a consciousness here available to us, which is not different from us. It's not other from us. It's our own consciousness that we're learning to claim and to embody more fully, if you like, as people, that is only available to us, really, insofar as we agree to come together and be interested alongside other people in exploring and developing these kinds of materials and learning together. And that seems to be um, a major emphasis in the work. And my experience of creating opportunities for people to come together and then encouraging those people to follow other opportunities themselves, so that they also then create other spaces where they can invite and meet other people, and so on and so on and so on. That becomes very compelling and, in a way, magnetizing of more interest, and yet more people being drawn into the field, if you like. So it seems to me that there's a live aspect here to this material, that really comes into its own as it speaks to and is worked with more and more people collectively at the same time.
Mm,
And that is one of the stated intentions behind the material, that these kinds of wisdom streams are intended to be used not primarily by what we experience as individuals, but by humanity as a whole, and in that sense are transformative of humanity as a whole, and indeed that is the larger purpose for which we are here.
mm. So, what do you think this is pointing to, this being human?
I think as a reader, you'd notice quite early on in book one, for example, that there are sensitivities being touched on or called out in you as an effect of the reading, seemingly, that in a way aren't realized as being new necessarily, but are realized as having always been there, in some way under the surfaces of oneself, as it were, and that are being touched and stimulated and reawakened through this kind of work. And these are sensitivities which are framed often as subtle. They seem to relate to our becoming more aware of the layered nature of reality of life as we know it. That there, in other words, that life actually can be experienced as a kind of more as a kind of a spectrum, ranging from the very material and physically manifest, further inside or towards expressions of life which are far less manifest, material, towards the completely immaterial in ways that we experience that. So that we're coming into contact with aspects of ourselves in selfhood, as it's expressed in the material, that are not here in physical reality as we know it. Far other different aspects of ourselves in terms of who we are actually. And this is to open to a range of sensitivities in oneself, called subtle sensitivities, whereby we become more aware of ourselves, of each other, and of life around us in these far less material ways. And that seems to me to be one of the basic or more fundamental building blocks in what's being referred here to as new human sensitivities. And then I think if you find that's for you, once you become really interested and then more engaged here, and indeed more realized in your daily life in subtle ways, then this in turn awakens or reawakens certain capacities in us, certain ways that we're able to be in daily life, which call upon far more of ourself in ways that we can approach concerns, choices, and dilemmas in our lives and in each other's lives, for example, um, and so on, towards developing particular aptitudes and skill sets, for example, in what we might frame as in terms of creativity or leadership and other familiar domains of human life, which become completely differently available to us through who we are becoming.
What's next?
So there's the field of work, which is expanding through the material that exists already and the ways the people so far have found the field and are engaging with it. And that field is growing. in surprising ways.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's new material, or material waiting to be newly introduced, which I can feel not so far off. And then there may well be in time other audio versions of the other books too. And then with regard to what's next, there are the two main books in the series so far, if you like, books 2 and 3, subtitled Being Human, Being World, where the emphasis is a bit less on the individual, on us as readers only, and more on helping us to realize the ways in which what we experience as the world around us is actually arising and formed through us all the time, so that all those problems, dilemmas, and indeed accelerating crises which seem to characterize our experience of world are framed, understood, and embodied differently through us as we work with the material and integrate those aspects of ourselves which previously we may have withheld from a fuller engagement with life as a human, seemingly in a world. And those two books go into quite a lot of detail on, and again, I think it's layered detail that is not always so perceptible upon a first reading, um, in ways that guide us towards realizing that not only do we live in a very different world than the one we may have thought we were living in before, but that we can actually and are very equipped to deal with what life seems to present us with by way of problems, dilemmas, and crises in radically different and creative ways. And in that sense, I find those books much more practically oriented. There are opportunities there through the suggested practices, if you like, to begin to understand from the inside what it means to become action in the world, to embody a sense of movement or action arising from within oneself that simply wants expression in ways that turn out to be far more um, holistic and all embracing than the ways perhaps so far we've learned to more usually engage with life and the world around us. And in a way, that brings us back to the starting point of this conversation, because with hindsight, I realized that what I was schooled in at the beginning of this material, what I was shown from the first experiences, was a way to allow, in a much more trusting and instinctive and intuitive way, to allow more of that inner life simply to arise through me and to be expressed as a form of action in the world around me. And that's the essence of what we're being invited to through these materials. It really is. That is, I would say, part of the foundation of what's here for us.
I'm I've been having a huge, I'm just touched by the immensity of this material.
Mm.
I was getting a real horizontal expansion and just and emotionally moved as I was listening. There's so much here. There's something in this dialogue that is bringing yet another layer to this for me.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I've
Yeah,
very much enjoyed being with you here.
thank you.